Rotational resin casting. In this video, I'm going to be showing the process of doing a rotational resin cast in a mold I made in a previous series of tutorials. So if you haven't been following that, definitely check out the end screen for these links to the previous videos on mold planning and the part 1 and 2 of this silicone halo helmet mold. Now, since yours truly does not have a rotational casting machine, I made a special field trip to Dallas, Texas to visit @Rhino Props. @Rhino Props has been a good friend for many years, and he was kind enough to let us put this mold on his machine. And he, of course, makes all kinds of cosplay props and accessories for Halo enthusiasts. So you can check him out on @Rhino Props on Instagram. And he does a lot of 3D printing and, of course, these beautiful vacuum form visors that he puts into these rotationally cast helmets that he makes. So anyway, check him out on Instagram for sure. I believe he also has a YouTube presence, so you can check that out there. And, of course, this is his rotational casting machine that he was kind enough to let us use for this video. Now, first off, for this process, we need to figure out the resin we're going to use. Now, as I mentioned in a previous tutorial, I'm going to be doing this with TC808 and also TC804. Now, first off, the TC808, that's the main resin I'm going to be covering in this tutorial. This, of course, has a 1-to-1 mix ratio, a 2 to 2.25 or so minute working time, and about a 10 to 20 minute demold. Now, we'll get back to that later because it's longer for rotational cast part because this is so thin. And TC808 cures to a very hard, impact-resistant 78 Shore D, which is nice to get that really hard resin, but also that really high impact resistance. Now, really important for rotational casting is that 200 centipoise mixed viscosity. We don't want something too low viscosity, and we don't want something too high that will trap a lot of air bubbles. So 200 centipoise is ideal for this, and then this also cures white or jet black. Now, for this video, I'll be casting this in the TC808, just the regular, which just cures white, and I'm not going to be adding any pigment to this. And this, of course, mixes 1-to-1 by weight. Now here I'm mixing up about 400 grams, about 200 grams of A and 200 grams of B, and I'm dispensing the B here, and you notice that I shook that B up really good before I poured that out. Real important, the part B on a lot of components like this will need to be shaken or stirred before dispense. So, and if it's sat for a while, you definitely want to do that because you don't want those critical components settling out and then causing cure issues. So make sure if the packaging says shake or stir, you want to do just that. So here we're mixing this up again, 1-to-1 by weight. And we're working in about a 65 to 70 degree workshop here. So we have more than enough time to get everything mixed and poured into the mold that's already on the rotational casting machine. And again, this is about a 400 gram batch. But real important for this kind of casting, you want to have everything ready to go because that really fast working time, we have enough time to get that thoroughly mixed, poured into the machine, we put in our little silicone stopper, and then we start the machine. So real important to have everything ready to go so you don't waste any time, because the last thing you want is for that resin to set up while it's just in a puddle at the bottom of your mold. Now we're going to do this in 2 batches. So this is the first batch here, and we're going to make sure this sits on the machine for more than the allotted working time. So make sure it gels before we add more resin. And to give you an idea what's happening inside this mold on the machine, it's moving at just enough speed that when we pour the resin into the mold and start that machine, the resin spreads out across the inside of the mold, not by centrifugal force, but just by tumbling the mold, we wind up with it starting to cling to the insides of the mold. So as that mold starts moving, we start coating the inside, and eventually as the material gels, it forms that thin skin all around the inside. And that's why that viscosity is really important. If you use something that's too low viscosity, it's going to all settle to the bottom. Now, once that gels, that part up at the top, that black part on the plug that you see right there, that part we will need to break that off to fill in the second layer. So once we stop the machine and open up that plug, we're going to use a screwdriver to break loose that little piece of resin there, and then add our second batch. And that's one of the things that's kind of hard to film, so I thought it'd work better to show you that in a diagram. So now we're ready to stop the machine and add our second batch of resin. Now what I have sitting to the side there and sticking my hand in there, that is the original resin batch that's on the machine right now. And that allows me to check and see where that's at before I add more resin. So once that's set up to the point where it's tack free, I'm ready to add some more resin. So this is another batch. Again, this is a 400 gram batch. And now I'm ready to put that little silicone cork in place. This is after we pulled out that little bit of resin on the end of that cork. Seal that up. And again, time is of the essence. You want to be very conscious of your time on this and start the machine. Now, Rhino's machine has a timer on it, so we can set this for about 15 or 20 minutes. But you want to make sure that your machine goes for longer than the working time of the material. So in this case, this has about a 2 to 2.5 minute or so working time. So we want to make sure that the machine is running for at least 5 or 10 minutes, because when you're working in really thin sections with polyurethanes, that will slow down that set time. So be aware of that. Make sure your machine is running for long enough that it can coat the insides of the mold and gel and cure to a point that it won't start slumping down and forming a puddle in the bottom of the mold. Now, the other important detail here is we actually went to lunch between the time you saw it on the machine and the time we're opening it up. It didn't have to run that amount of time, but when you're casting really thin cross sections like this, it's a good idea to let the resin cure for at least an hour or more. So this had sat for about an hour and a half after the last pour. And really important, because when you're casting really thin sections, it will take those longer to cure than thick sections. So it's actually the inverse of an air drying material. Now this is the fun part to demold this part. I had to remember how I demolded that original 3D print. Did take some elbow grease to do it. The first time is always the trickiest to get that out. And then once you learn the mold, it's a lot easier. So again, make sure you give those thin section parts plenty of time before you demold those, because even though the data sheet will say 10 to 20 minutes, when you're doing really thin parts like this, you want to give it extra time to cure up to full strength. Now I'm going to show just a quick overview of casting another copy using TC804 Jet Black. Again, this is using two 400 gram batches of TC804, and TC804 has a longer working time. This has a 7 to 8 minute working time, but still a relatively fast demold time of about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the cross section of the part. Now, because this is such a thin walled part, it's a good idea to wait even longer. So again, here we're waiting 2 hours at least before demolding that thin part. So here are our black and white helmets cast in both the 808 and the TC804. And of course, for those of you curious about the impact resistance of these resins, these are very strong resins in a very thin cross section. So don't want to take any rounds to the head in that, but it's nice and strong. So definitely tough impact resistant parts in both the TC808 and the 804. And of course, the Corgi approves. Now, this is probably obvious to the resin casters out there, but obviously that visor area and the neck area underneath are all areas to be cut out later. So Rhino's going to trim those up. And again, you can see the finished results on his channel, but you see the inside is nice and smooth. And of course, I'll be linking all of the materials used in this tutorial in the video description. So be sure to check that out. Now, one final word about mold release. I didn't use any mold release when casting these helmets, but if you did, I'd recommend using E302 paintable mold release. That has minimal residue that's easy to be cleaned from cast resin parts. Now, if you missed the original tutorials where we made this mold for this Halo helmet, definitely check that out. I'll link that on the end screen, both parts 1 and 2, as well as the planning video where we designed this mold. So check those out here on the end screen. And of course, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. And thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting the channel.